In 2013, a geneticist ran a routine mitochondrial DNA test on some distant relatives of one of the most famous families in Britain, and what came back made him double, then triple-check his own results before he was willing to believe them. The DNA pointed somewhere nobody expected, not to the old English and Scottish aristocratic lines the family had always claimed, to India, specifically to a woman who had been quietly written out of the official record almost 2 centuries earlier, a woman whose name barely survives in the documents that do mention her, and whose real identity had been deliberately altered by the very family that descended from her. That woman's genetic legacy, passed silently down an unbroken maternal line for nearly 200 years, had ended up inside the DNA of Princess Diana, which meant it was sitting, quietly and unknowingly, inside 2 future kings of England. This is the real story of that discovery, and the woman history nearly succeeded in erasing. It starts in the late 18th century in the port city of Surat on the western coast of India during the height of British colonial expansion. The East India Company, at that point functioning less like a business and more like a private empire, controlled enormous swaths of trade and territory across the Indian subcontinent, and thousands of young British men were sent out to work for it, often for years or decades at a stretch, far from home. One of those men was a Scottish merchant named Theodore Forbes, born in 1788, stationed in Surat as part of the company's sprawling commercial network. In Surat, Forbes formed a relationship with a woman named Eliza Kewark. The historical record on Eliza herself is thin and inconsistent, which turns out to matter enormously to this story. Some documents from the period describe her as Armenian. Others refer to her simply as a housekeeper. What's clear is that she and Theodore had a relationship that produced at least 2 children, a daughter named Catherine Forbes and a son named Alexander. Theodore never married Eliza, and he never legally acknowledged the relationship in any formal way that would have given her standing as his wife. As his career progressed, Theodore made a decision that would ripple down through the following 2 centuries. When Catherine was around 8 years old and Alexander around 6, he arranged for the children to be sent to Britain, away from their mother, to be raised by his relatives in Aberdeenshire, Scotland. Theodore himself died during the journey home and was buried at sea, never returning to Surat or to Eliza. The 2 children arrived in Scotland as orphans in practical terms, taken in by their father's family. Catherine remained in Scotland and was absorbed into Scottish society. Alexander was eventually sent back to India. Letters survive from Eliza to the Forbes family, written after her children were taken from her, and they read as exactly what they are: a mother pleading for information about her own children, desperate for any contact, any acknowledgement that they still existed to her. In his own will, Theodore never referred to Eliza with anything resembling the language of a wife or partner. He referred to her, coldly, as the purported mother of Catherine, and elsewhere described her as his housekeeper, language that reduced a woman who had borne his children into something closer to hired help in the official written record. It's what happened after that which turns this into a genuinely fascinating case study in how history gets quietly rewritten. The Scottish relatives who raised Catherine changed the recorded identity of her mother. Eliza Kewark, a woman from India, became, in the family's own records, and in the version of the story passed down through subsequent generations, an Armenian woman instead. Given the racial attitudes of 19th century British colonial society, where the idea of Indian ancestry and an aristocratic bloodline would have been treated as a genuine scandal, this wasn't a careless mistake. It was a deliberate act of narrative control, the kind of quiet historical revision that colonial-era families across Britain engaged in constantly, reshaping inconvenient ancestry into something more socially acceptable. And it worked well enough that the altered version became the accepted family history for generations. What that revision couldn't touch, because nobody at the time had any way of knowing it existed, was Eliza's mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA works differently from the rest of your genetic code, and that difference is exactly what makes this story scientifically possible at all. While most of your DNA is a shuffled combination of both parents, mitochondrial DNA is passed down almost entirely unchanged from mother to child, generation after generation, essentially untouched by the father's genetic contribution at all. The son inherits his mother's mitochondrial DNA but can't pass it on to his own children, while a daughter inherits it and does pass it forward. That means mitochondrial DNA traces one single unbroken maternal line, mother to daughter, stretching back through history with a kind of genetic fidelity almost nothing else in the genome offers. It's the same basic technique, incidentally, that let researchers identify the remains of King Richard III when they were uncovered beneath a car park in Leicester in 2012, using an unbroken maternal line traced across more than 5 centuries. Catherine, raised in Scotland, grew up, married a man named James Crombie, and had a daughter. That daughter had a daughter of her own, and so on. An unbroken maternal chain running for generation after generation, through the 19th century, through the Industrial Revolution, through 2 world wars, entirely invisible, entirely unremarked upon, until it eventually arrived at Frances Shand Kidd, and through her, at Frances's daughter, Diana Spencer, who would become known to the world as Princess Diana. Diana herself, by all accounts, never knew any of this. She grew up understanding her ancestry the way her family had always presented it, as a line of English and Scottish aristocracy, entirely unaware that, carried quietly in her own cells, was the genetic legacy of a woman from India whose identity her own ancestors had deliberately concealed. The discovery itself came in 2013, 16 years after Diana's death, when geneticist Jim Wilson of the University of Edinburgh, working with the genetic ancestry testing company Britain's DNA, decided to investigate the mysterious references to Eliza Kewark that kept surfacing in Spencer family historical records. Wilson had a genuine, long-standing interest in genealogy and genetics, and the inconsistencies around Eliza's recorded identity, Armenian in some documents, described in vaguer terms elsewhere, were exactly the kind of unresolved historical puzzle that mitochondrial testing is well suited to help untangle. Wilson and his team located living relatives descended from the same maternal line, distant cousins rather than members of the royal family itself, who agreed to provide DNA samples. When the mitochondrial results came back, they matched a genuinely rare genetic marker, one strongly associated with South Asian populations rather than Armenian or broader Middle Eastern ancestry. Wilson has publicly described being startled by the result, requiring repeated verification before he was confident enough in the finding to stand behind it, precisely because it ran so directly against the accepted family narrative that had stood unquestioned for nearly 2 centuries. Cross-referencing the genetic findings against the historical paper trail, Wilson's team traced the maternal line back through Catherine Forbes, back to Theodore Forbes and his household in Surat, and directly to Eliza Kewark. The genetic evidence, combined with the documentary record including Eliza's own surviving letters, pointed to one consistent conclusion. The Spencer family's maternal line included direct ancestry from India, not Armenia, and that lineage ran unbroken all the way to Princess Diana, and through her to Prince William and Prince Harry. It's worth being precise about exactly what this does and doesn't mean scientifically, because mitochondrial inheritance has a specific, narrow logic to it. Both William and Harry inherited this mitochondrial DNA from their mother, meaning it's genuinely, verifiably part of their genetic makeup. But mitochondrial DNA only passes from mother to child, which means William himself won't pass this specific maternal lineage onto his own children, since that requires an unbroken line of mothers, and the line continues instead through his sisters or aunts on the maternal side, not through him directly to his own kids. Still, the fact remains that the current heir to the throne and his brother both carry documented genetic ancestry tracing back to a South Asian woman living in India in the late 18th century, a fact that would have been almost unthinkable to acknowledge within the framework of Victorian and Edwardian aristocratic identity that the Spencer family had spent generations carefully constructing. When the story broke publicly in 2013, it generated real widespread press coverage, precisely because of how directly it cut against the mythology of an unbroken, purely European royal bloodline. Some members of the extended Spencer family responded with genuine openness. Diana's aunt gave interviews acknowledging that she'd always been told the family had Armenian ancestry, and expressing that she was pleased, rather than troubled, to learn the more accurate picture of where that ancestry actually came from. The palace itself offered no dramatic official statement, which is broadly consistent with how the royal family has historically handled unexpected genealogical revelations, allowing the story to exist in the public record without amplifying or directly contesting it. Beyond the genetic specifics, what makes Eliza Kewark's story genuinely significant is what it reveals about a much larger, well-documented pattern from the colonial era. Thousands of British men serving with the East India Company formed relationships, sometimes casual, sometimes clearly loving and long-term, with local Indian women during their postings. The children born from these relationships, often referred to at the time as Anglo-Indian, frequently faced exactly the pattern Catherine and Alexander experienced. Separation from their Indian mothers, relocation to Britain, and a systematic effort by British relatives to minimize, obscure, or entirely erase the Indian side of their ancestry from the official family record, precisely because the racial attitudes of the period treated that ancestry as a source of social shame rather than simply a fact of family history. Eliza Kewark's specific story stands out from that broader, largely undocumented pattern mainly because of a genuine historical accident. Her genetic legacy happened to survive, unbroken, in a family line that eventually produced one of the most photographed and closely documented women in modern history. Most Anglo-Indian family histories from this era were never traced with this level of genealogical or genetic precision, and most of those erased maternal lines were never recovered at all. What happened with Eliza Kewark is less a unique event and more a rare, visible instance of a pattern that almost certainly played out, quietly and untraceably, across a great many British families with roots in colonial India, of families where a similar act of narrative substitution simply succeeded completely, with no later genetic test ever surfacing to correct the record. There's a detail from Diana's own life that takes on a different resonance once you know this history, even though it's worth being careful not to overstate its significance. In 1992, during a royal tour, Diana was photographed sitting alone in front of the Taj Mahal, an image that became widely understood at the time as a symbol of her loneliness within an unhappy marriage. She had no way of knowing at that point about her own documented ancestral connection to India. The image doesn't carry some hidden intentional meaning, since neither she nor anyone else was aware of the connection in 1992. But it's a genuinely striking historical coincidence that the woman who would, years after her death, be shown to carry a documented maternal line back to India was photographed, unknowingly, in one of that country's most iconic locations. What this story ultimately demonstrates, beyond the specific facts of one family's history, is something genetics has proven capable of again and again: recovering identities and histories that were deliberately obscured by the people and institutions with the power to control the official record. Eliza Kework was reduced in Theodore Forbes' own will to the purported mother of his daughter and to the label of housekeeper, language that stripped away her actual relationship to him and her children. His Scottish relatives went further, replacing her actual identity with a fabricated one that better fit the social expectations of their time. For nearly 2 centuries, that fabricated version simply became the accepted truth, repeated and passed down without anyone left alive who knew otherwise. Mitochondrial DNA doesn't care about any of that. It's passed down as a matter of biology, indifferent to whatever story a family chooses to tell about itself, which is exactly what made it possible, nearly 200 years later, for a geneticist running a fairly routine genealogical test to stumble onto a piece of history that an entire family, and by extension, an entire institution, had quietly left buried. Eliza Kework's own letters show a woman desperately trying to hold onto some connection to the children who'd been taken from her, met with silence, denial, and eventually erasure. The DNA succeeded where her letters couldn't. It carried her identity forward anyway, silently, through generation after generation of women who never knew her name, until it surfaced in a laboratory in Edinburgh in 2013, in the genetic code of 2 young princes who, until that point, had no idea their family tree included her at all. If uncovering real, documented stories like this, where DNA quietly overturns a version of history someone worked hard to rewrite, is what you're here for, subscribe. Because it turns out even the most carefully guarded family trees aren't as airtight as the people who built them believed.